let me introduce Rob. Rob is the director of InterVision's Microsoft Cloud Services. In other words, he's the Microsoft maestro. He has over 25 years experience designing, planning, implementing, and maintaining Microsoft Cloud and infrastructure solutions and managing high-performance Microsoft teams. And I'll put in a plug for the Status Go podcast. Rob is going to be on the podcast on the episode that airs next Monday. So you'll want to join in that for listening to Rob go a little bit deeper dive in cloud for companies in the SMB space. With that, Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, I appreciate it. Can you hear me and can you see my presentation?
Yes and yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll go ahead and get rolling here. I have the coveted last slot of the day, so how exciting is that? So as Jeff mentioned, I head up the Microsoft Cloud Practice team here at InterVision. Let me just kind of start, whoops, there we go. We're going to start out with a poll and really would just like to see what describes best your Microsoft Cloud journey. It's from we're all in to maybe we're just get started, but we would like to get an idea of where you all sit, and we'll check in on the results on that in a little bit. But for the moment, I'm going to get going here. So what I wanted to talk through to kind of start out with today are some themes we're seeing in 2023, right? What are folks interested in? Where are we seeing companies look? What things are going on? A lot of this is going to have threads that go back to previous presentations you've seen. A lot of this has got threads that go back to COVID and before. And we'll kind of point those out as we're going along. So first big theme, of course, is by this point in time, most organizations have some footprint in the cloud, whether that be a workload, multiple workloads. There's some amount that's being done, and specifically in the Microsoft space, that may be Exchange Online, that could be Azure, maybe you're doing hybrid deployment or DR as a service, or full lift and shift of servers out to the cloud, but you've got some amount of footprint out in the cloud. We're all being asked to do more with less. That's probably the big theme we're seeing for 2023. We've all seen layoffs at the beginning of this year. We're dealing with inflation. We're dealing with talks of recession, debt ceiling limits. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world right now, and folks are just being asked to try to tighten the belt, do more with the tools you've already got. The third theme is, hybrid work is here to stay. This really started prior to COVID, but hit big time during that work from home period during COVID. I've been working from home for the bulk of my career here with InterVision. The closest office for me is an hour away. The big change that happened once COVID hit is I didn't have to pretend anymore that I was at home. We all got kind of comfortable with that idea. But again, during that time period, companies downsized office spaces, companies hired folks that maybe weren't local. They just learned, hey, we spend a lot, we can get a lot more accomplished when we're not driving back and forth between offices and customer sites, et cetera. So you'll see kind of that, that continues to be a trend as well. Data centers are shrinking. As more and more things move out to the cloud, we need less and less compute and storage on-prem. Now that compute and storage continues to age, and so customers are looking around going, what do I actually need left on premise? We're hearing one of the big conversations my group has been hearing about is, do we even need Active Directory anymore? Can we just, that's how far along on this data center shrinking conversation we found ourselves. And then, of course, the last one is security is more important than ever. That has been a focus, even though today I think is the cloud day, tomorrow is the security day. You'll notice every presentation talked about security because it is super important to everybody, regardless of where they're located. That's being driven by a number of things. One, as more data is in the cloud, we need to make sure we're securing that properly, but also things like we just heard, ransomware, cyber insurance requirements. We've heard from customers who maybe didn't have any of their own compliance requirements. Maybe they didn't have to support HIPAA or GDPR or FedRAMP, or pick your favorite acronym. But what we are seeing are cases of where you're a subcontractor and you're being asked to maybe comply with your prime contractor's compliancy requirements. So even small customers that thought they didn't have any compliancy requirements are finding themselves dealing with those. And so again, big themes we're seeing for 2023. So what I want to spend the rest of my time doing is kind of talking through some of the answers to some of those questions that we're seeing, kind of the big thematic answers for these big thematic themes.
And Rob,
George,
we have responses to our poll.
okay.
And so coming in number one was B. We have at least one workload in Microsoft 365.
Okay.
Second place, we have, that looks like the same answer. Sorry, let me see if I can slide that
I
up.
think the second one was like Microsoft 365 and Azure.
And
Right?
Azure, yes, and that was number two. Then
Okay.
number three is we're not using any Microsoft cloud services. And number four was we're all in. So there you
Okay.
go.
Perfect. And that kind of fits where I thought this would land, right? I mean, that's that's kind of one of the keys of this whole thing is the move to the cloud is not a one-time deal, it's a journey. And so the fact that we've got folks that are a little bit in, toes in the water, is pretty is a pretty common answer. Now, funny enough, I threw this slide in because I wanted to talk about kind of the different levels of cloud as a service, not knowing that the presentation right before it would have it as well. So I won't go too much into this, but I do kind of want to talk a little bit about it, right? So again, as you move through the various levels from on-prem, where you manage and own everything, through infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, more and more of the stack becomes the responsibility of the individual cloud vendor. Now, how different cloud vendors, and Microsoft has services in all three of those buckets, right? They've got infrastructure, platform, SaaS. Typically, when we're talking infrastructure and platform as a service, that's Azure software as a service. That's typically the Microsoft 365 solution. So they've got solutions in all three of those buckets. How the cloud journey tends to flow is a little different from vendor to vendor. In the Microsoft world, really they started life with the productivity solution, their productivity solutions being moved out to the cloud. So they started life on the software as a service side. So their migration path tends to be find what you can move to SaaS, look at what's left. You can then lift and shift that out to infrastructure as a service. And then you could potentially go a step further and look at what's left and modernize those various applications using platform as a service. So the things the innovation group talked about earlier today, right? This is where that would come into play. So we've had some cases, for instance, where customers have done what they can in software as a service, but maybe they've got some homegrown application like an Access database they've built, they've a remote, they've built that on-prem. They need to modernize that. There's obviously not a commercially available SaaS, solution because that was something they built in-house. We can then look at modernizing that. So that's kind of the Microsoft approach. We kind of start on the SaaS side. What's left goes to infrastructure, and then ultimately that can be modernized using platform as a service. So the first of the big kind of thematic answers to those thematic themes we're going to talk about is modern file sharing. So again, as a lot of you mentioned, you've already got at least one workload in the cloud. Most likely that first workload is Exchange. That just tends to be the very first one folks move out to the cloud. And one of the things folks really like about that is this ability to get anytime, anywhere access to email. Now, Exchange tended to be that first workload move to the cloud because it was heavy. It was hard on IT to administer. But a lot of the other workloads, they just kind of existed in the background. Folks didn't think much about them. File sharing was one of those, right? We stand up a file share, we set up permissions, life is good. We don't think much about it until COVID hit. And all of a sudden, folks went home, and those file shares that were really easy to get to became cumbersome. We now had to fire up a VPN connection to gain access to that data prior to prior to then connecting to the F drive, the G drive, S drives, whatever you have. Boy, wouldn't it be great to not have to do that and kind of have that same anywhere, anytime access to that file share data. SharePoint and OneDrive can become the answers to those questions. SharePoint for corporate data, OneDrive for personal data, respectively. So those can together work to solve this particular file sharing journey. Now, a couple interesting things come with this, right? The first is a lot of the Office 365 licenses include space, typically a terabyte plus that you just have as part of your subscriptions. And so for a lot of organizations, this became kind of a no-brainer. Wow, if I just lift and shift this data out to SharePoint and OneDrive, I can do that without any additional licensing. I just gotta kind of make that journey, kind of figure out, does it work? But if I can, that's a great benefit. The second benefit, of course, is that at anytime, anywhere access we mentioned, and that's from any device as well, right? You're now not just tied to a Windows machine, but this could be Mac, this could be iOS, this could be Android, whatever that particular device is. But a couple other big things come by doing nothing more than lifting and shifting that data out. The first big one is co-authoring. Now, if you're familiar with the Google side of the house, that concept is pretty familiar, but for those of you who may or may not be as familiar, co-authoring is exactly like it sounds, the ability for multiple people to work on a file simultaneously. I typically here will tell a story about how we would develop like a PowerPoint presentation where maybe there's multiple presenters that are going on. Typically, the way those things come into existence is marketing creates a template, maybe does the first couple slides, sends it to the next person. That next person in turn will add their data. It'll move on to the next person as things go on. Somewhere along the way, the first person forgot that they needed to add some additional data. Now we've got multiple copies of the PowerPoint we're trying to get together, and the poor last person really is out of luck because they're delivered the PowerPoint about 4 p.m. the day before it's due. So they're now scrambling to get things done. If you're able to do that together, we no longer have to deal with that cycle. Everybody can be in there working in the schedule that makes the most sense. Now, that scares the heck out of people as well, right? Because what if Bob gets in there and totally wrecks the presentation? Another thing you get out of the box with this is version control. So we can very easily roll back in the event that there's issues. So one of these big areas we're seeing folks interested in kind of this post-COVID world. The second big theme is collaboration, right? Modernizing collaboration. Again, folks had collaboration had been one of those nice to have tools, things like Teams, Jabber, Slack. They were kind of nice to have prior to COVID. We didn't really think too much about them though, because we could just walk to the office next door and talk to somebody versus sending them a message. COVID hit, everybody went home. All of a sudden, those kinds of tools went from, niceties to lifeblood for the organization. So folks started to use them pretty heavily. Another piece, though, of collaboration that kind of fit into this category was phones. Again, prior to COVID, people were pretty happy with whatever phone system they had. I mean, if it was out of the 60s, who cared, right? It was a handset, I could dial a number, I could forward calls. I didn't think a lot about it. COVID happened, folks went home. We would start to talk to customers about how is your work from home strategy going? And we would hear things like, pretty good, except for the receptionist who has to go into the office because the phone system is literally glued to the wall in the office. Wouldn't it be nice to have that same kind of anytime, anywhere access to voice as we do email and file sharing like we just talked about? And you can do that with things like Teams phone system. That Teams phone system allows us to migrate the PBX out to the cloud. And now things like Teams or your handset just become an endpoint. Anywhere I happen to be connected, I'm plugged into that cloud-based PBX. So now the receptionist can sit at home, answer the main line, do cold or consultative handoffs to others in the organization who can be in the office and or at home themselves. You don't have to be thinking so much about where somebody is, just are they online, are they available, and wherever they happen to be available from, they can partake in this collaboration solution. Conferencing is another one that's kind of gone through this metamorphosis, right? We started life prior to COVID with, we just met in an office or in a conference room. We didn't need any special tools. We all went home. Then we just used things like desktop collaboration tools. Shoot, now we're back in a hybrid. How do I get those folks who are working remotely into meetings in the office for those of us that are sitting in conference rooms? And so there's a full line of room systems that can be hooked into these that go everywhere from small huddle room solutions up to large executive conference room solutions that you can deploy and allow, again, that kind of hybrid collaboration experience that we're finding ourselves more and more in. The third theme I'm going to bring up is probably not one that's going to resonate with everybody, but for those that need this hits pretty quickly. So this is remote workspace and things like Azure Virtual Desktop. So remote workspace is the ability to deliver multi-session Windows clients from the cloud. If this sounds a whole like VDI, that's exactly what this is. The difference is it's VDI in the cloud. Where we see this coming into play for customers are in a couple places. The first is, again, hybrid work. Folks may be working from home. Folks may be working from their own personal devices from home. Man, I don't really want them to be connecting to corporate data directly from that personal device. I'd really like to put some sort of air gap between the two. And so a remote desktop session can provide you that, right? There's now from that personal device, you hop into your work Windows session, and then in that work session is where you do your work from. There is now that separation between the personal device and the work data. The other bit comes into play with high performance needs. So we've talked to a couple companies that are doing things like CAD or coding, for instance. They may have some real high horsepower workstations in the office, but for remote needs, they may just have basic laptops that can do things like Office, email, web browsing. They just don't have the horsepower, though, to run a full CAD solution. And so you can use Azure Virtual Desktops to help augment that experience as well. There are a number of virtual GPU options that are available that can allow you to run CAD systems in the cloud, again, through a remote desktop session. So now I don't have to go out and purchase, a super heavy duty workstation grade laptop for everybody. We can just use lightweight machines and provide that additional horsepower when needed. Again, nothing I just described is new. You could do this with things like Citrix or remote desktop in the past. The big difference, though, is it's being delivered from the cloud, and so you get that ability to scale on demand. With traditional solutions, I kind of have to be thinking about what's my busiest day going to look like. Maybe on the worst case scenario, I'm going to have to deal with 500 folks connecting in through this remote workspace. Traditional system, that means I have to build that environment for 500 users, even if I only got 10 on a regular basis. With something like this, you can scale that up on demand. For most of the time, you're paying for 10 sessions, then you scale up when you need it. So again, nothing new, but the ability to kind of deliver this through the cloud as you need it and kind of scale that demand to meet your needs. The last bit I want to talk about is overarching security. So again, if there's been something you've heard the most during these presentations, is security matters a lot. There's been a couple scenarios that have been thrown out already. I'll kind of talk through those again as well. But I want to start on the endpoint side of the house. And there's a polling question that goes along with this as well. What endpoint management solution do you use today? Um, Again, prior to COVID, folks were pretty happy with whatever they had. Maybe they were just using group policy with Active Directory to do kind of lightweight management of Windows machines. Maybe you were using things like Config Manager or other third-party management tools. That all worked great as long as those machines were sitting in the office. As soon as everybody went home, things got complicated, right? Because how do I reach out and touch these machines remotely when they're not always in the office? One of the answers to that question becomes Intune. Microsoft Intune allows you to do a lot of those remote management capabilities from the cloud. That's not only with Windows, but also Mac, iOS, and Android. So you can manage all those devices. That can be things that you might traditionally use group policy for, maybe enforcing password requirements or other configuration settings on the machine, pushing out remote software. You can even do things, you can even use things like autopilot to do kind of out of the box configuration for new machines. So maybe if you ship a machine directly from Dell to a user that's located out in the field, that machine can then be basically, quote, imaged. I hate to use that word, but kind of imaged on the fly with the applications and settings you need. This also applies on the mobile device side. Mobile device management, again, can consist of very similar activities. Another thing that's popped up, though, a lot of times in mobile device management is these are personal devices. And man, I really want to separate data. So managed data can't escape into unmanaged applications. So maybe I want to make sure somebody can't copy text out of Outlook for iOS and put it in Facebook. You can build those kind of application fences around managed applications with Intune. So lots of power that comes as part of that endpoint management strategy. Have we given enough folks time to chime in on that one?
We have, Rob. In fact, we have a tie
Okay.
between A and B. A, on-premises solution like Config Manager, and
Okay.
B, a cloud solution like Intune. We're tied.
Okay,
Uh,
great.
so, yeah.
And probably the reason we're seeing that tide is folks are you can actually use both of those together. That's another option as well, right? So if you're trying to bridge in the hybrid world, the two things together, that's possible as well. So lots of power there, lots of capability to kind of do what makes the most sense if you're in the office versus remote, lots of possibilities there. The other side of the security, the security coin is data leakage, right? I want to make sure stuff in the cloud stays where I want to have it at. We've talked a lot about anytime, anywhere access. That's awesome, but we can be bad too, right? Because bad actors could get access to your data anytime, anywhere potentially. So we want to make sure we put in place the proper gates to support that. And there's a number of tools we can bring to bear at that. There's permissions, various DLP tools, conditional access can be set up so we can do things like build conditions. Maybe a condition is we only allow data to be downloaded on a managed machine. Managed machine gets marked by Intune, so those things can be used together. Maybe you build geofences where folks can only log on from geographies you're going to have employees accessing data from. Again, lots of combinations we can make work there. Cyber insurance has come up a couple times, I think, today, and this plays into one of these as well. So as was mentioned, I think a couple presentations ago, ransomware continues to be a big problem as cyber insurance companies are having to pay ransoms. They are cracking down on the requirements for cyber insurance. One of those is multi-factor authentication, right? That keeps coming up. The problem, folks should have that turned on. The problem with it is, though, a lot of times folks haven't budgeted for this, right? So they're getting notified, hey, in order to renew, you need to turn on MFA. So they haven't budgeted for it for this fiscal year. But the second is a lot of times they have a month or so to react, right? Hey, your insurance expires next month. You have to have this turned on in order to renew. So folks come to us and, kind of panicked, like, I need MFA and I need it today, and I have no budget to do it. What can I do? If they're an Office 365 customer, this becomes a fairly easy answer. Azure MFA is baked into almost every SKU available, so we can typically turn this on. There's just configuration that needs to be done to enable this, decide what factors we'll use, things like that. But we can get that flipped on fairly easily for customers. And again, there's usually no additional monthly cost involved in that. That's great for Office 365, but typically customers are also being asked to make sure they have this in place on any sort of gateway into the organization. The other big common one that pops up are VPN solutions. Well, shoot, how do I get MFA there? Well, the answer to that in a lot of cases becomes pretty easy as well, using single sign-on. Azure AD supports single sign-on with almost any application that supports SAML. We go ahead and get SAML set up. That application will then push the push the authentication over to Azure AD by virtue of you having MFA turned on for that other application. MFA will now fire for that application as well. And then the last bit I'll bring up is persistent security and labeling. A lot of the compliancy requirements require things like labeling to be enabled. So you can label devices or label documents as important or sensitive or things like that. You can even go as far as putting persistent security on a document. That's always been a problem, right? You can put security around containers, but as soon as I take a file from like a file share and attach it to an email, that security is gone. That can cause big problems. What if I could build security into the documents themselves? And with Azure Information Protection, we can do things just like that. So there's a lot of capability in the security space, a lot of interest depending on where your needs are. So that kind of brings me to the end. Kind of my last thought before I turn the floor back over to Jeff is I'll kind of steal Jeff's next question, which is what should we do next? A lot of the questions I get are, well, we're in the cloud. Where do I go next? And really, again, if you get nothing out of today, just be aware cloud is a journey. Odds are high, even if you thought you've done everything, there's been new features, whether it's new components of applications you're already using or services you're not using, but there's always another thing to be looking at. So if anything we said today resonated, let us know. We can talk through any of these points with you. But also, again, if you just haven't discussed cloud in a while, it's always, I would say, about 6 months or so minimum. Take a look because these products are constantly growing, constantly expanding. The features are more and more capability is showing up. So that's what I had.
Rob, thank you very much. One question I want to toss your way, and then we'll close things out for the day.
Okay.
Can SharePoint work as a file replacement in all cases? Anything specifically we should look out for if we're considering that?
Yeah, so one of the reasons Exchange tends to be one of the first workloads moved is it almost is totally transparent to the user. SharePoint, there is a bit of a workflow change because you are using a browser or there's the way you access you won't access data through like an F drive or G drive anymore. So there is a workflow change. And with that, not every application will work with SharePoint. Most of the big ones do, obviously all the Office apps, things like Adobe, Autodesk applications, a lot of stuff will, but not everything does. So what we'll typically do with customers is work through like a proof of concept where we copy up some initial data, get some, work with you to get the initial governance and security in place, and then see if there's any of those problematic use cases that pop up.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And again, Rob is going to be a guest on Status Go on the episode that airs Monday. So if you want to learn more, that'd be a great way to continue to dive into this type of topic.